The wind howled like a living thing that night, clawing against the glass walls of Jonathan Pierce's mountainside home. Snow moved in waves across the valley, swirling under the floodlights that cut pale circles into the darkness. Inside, everything was still. The fire in the stone hearth had burned low, casting a soft amber glow across the clean, orderly room. Jonathan sat in his leather armchair, staring at the unread emails on his laptop screen, though he wasn't really seeing any of them. His reflection hovered in the glass like a ghost, sharp jaw, gray-flecked hair, eyes that had forgotten how to hold warmth. He had once been the kind of man whose name turned meetings silent. A billionaire who built industries. A visionary, they'd called him. But those were old words, hollow now. The silence in the house had become his only companion. Outside, the storm thickened. Snow tapped at the windows like fingertips. He was reaching for his glass of scotch when the sound broke through. 3 faint knocks. So soft he thought maybe the house had groaned, shifting under the cold. Then it came again. Sharper this time, almost swallowed by the wind. Jonathan slowly rose. No one came up this mountain. Not without calling. Not in weather like this. He opened the door. And there she was. A little girl, no more than 7, her blonde hair tangled with snowflakes, her boots soaked through, her coat too thin for winter. She clutched a stuffed fox to her chest, one eye missing, its seams worn from being held too tight too often. Her cheeks were raw from the cold, her lips pale. But her eyes were the part that made his breath catch. They were too old, too tired for someone so small. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling like the wind behind her. "Please help me find my mom." Jonathan didn't speak at first. His throat felt tight, as though the cold had moved inside him. "Come in," he managed, stepping aside. The warmth of the house seemed to swallow her whole. He wrapped a blanket around her tiny shoulders. She sat at the kitchen table, small hands gripping the mug of cocoa he placed in front of her. Steam curled in front of her face, but she didn't drink. "My mom didn't come home," she said softly, staring into the mug as though the truth was hidden there. "She works at the energy plant." "The one in Brighton." Jonathan froze. The plant. His plant, once. Before the lawsuits, before the buyout, before he walked away and told himself it wasn't his responsibility anymore. "What's your name?" he asked. She lifted her eyes to his. "Lily." He nodded slowly, like the world had begun to shift under his feet. "And your mom?" "Rachel Carter." The name hit him like a blow. He knew it. Not personally, but through the endless reports, the lists of employees affected by the restructuring, the layoffs during the acquisition. People who'd been small lines on spreadsheets. Now one of them was sitting in his kitchen. Outside, the storm raged, swallowing the mountains whole. Jonathan sat across from the child who should have been scared, crying, shaking, but she wasn't. She held herself still, steady, like someone who understood the world could take things without warning. He looked into her eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'll help you." He didn't know it yet, but the moment he spoke those words, the life he'd been hiding in ended. Everything he thought he'd buried was already rising in the storm. The storm did not ease by morning. It pressed against the windows like something determined to get in, a white wall of wind and frozen breath. Jonathan hadn't slept. He had sat in the living room while Lily slept curled up on the couch, her little hands still gripping the worn stuffed fox as though it were the only solid thing in a world that slipped and dissolved around her. When she woke, she didn't cry. She didn't ask for food or warmth or comfort. She simply stood, pulling on her damp boots with quiet resolve. Children weren't supposed to know resolve. Not like this. Jonathan gathered his keys and a thick coat, layering it over hers. She blinked up at him, not with hope exactly, but something close to it. Trust earned too fast, given because she had no other choice. The truck struggled against the snow as they descended the mountain road. The world outside was muted into soft grays, everything buried beneath winter's silence. The few houses they passed sat dark, windows shuttered against the cold. No one was out. No one saw them go. Lily pointed when they reached the old Parkway Road. Her voice was barely audible over the wipers. She takes this way home. Every night. When the lights are on, I watch for her car from the window. Jonathan nodded, following the direction of her small hand. The snow deepened, gathering in drifts along the edges of the asphalt. He slowed as they rounded a bend. That's her car. The vehicle was half swallowed by the snowbank, one door hanging open as though someone had stepped out mid-breath. Frost crusted the windows. The interior was empty. A lunchbox lay in the back seat, its lid cracked, a bruised apple still inside. Jonathan stepped out into the cold. It bit hard, sharp and metallic. Lily stayed beside him, her boots sinking into the snow. "She always closes the door," she said quietly. He walked around the car, the wind slicing through his coat. That was when he saw them, a trail of footprints nearly erased by the storm. Small, light steps at first, then deeper impressions as though someone had been running. The tracks led toward the woods. The trees stood like dark sentinels, silent, watching. The wind no longer howled here. It whispered. Jonathan felt something twist in his chest. Fear, not for himself, but for the child beside him. "Stay close," he murmured. They followed the trail until it dissolved into untouched snow. The storm had buried whatever story the earth had tried to tell. But something else caught his eye. Fabric, snagged on a low branch. A scarf, pale gray, now stained with something darker. Something that did not belong to winter. Lily stepped forward, her small body trembling, but not from cold. "That's my mama's," she whispered. Jonathan took the scarf in his hands. The initials were stitched delicately along the edge, RC. The world felt very still. A low rumble echoed through the valley. Engines. More than one. Not rescue vehicles. Not in weather like this. Jonathan lifted Lily into his arms and turned back toward the truck, moving quickly now, heart pounding. Someone else was out here. Someone who did not want Rachel Carter to be found. They reached the truck just as the sound of the engines faded into the trees. Not close enough to see, but close enough to be deliberate. Jonathan felt the weight of it settle in his chest, heavy and cold. He opened the passenger door and helped Lily climb in. Her hands trembled now, the first real crack in her stillness. She clutched the fox tighter to her chest. "Are they looking for us?" she asked. He didn't answer. Not yet. He didn't want to lie. The only truth he had was unfinished. The road into Brighton was slow, the snow clearing to wet, gray sludge as they descended from the mountains. The town looked tired, windows fogged, chimneys coughing smoke reluctantly into the air. It had always been this way, even when his company was thriving, but he hadn't noticed then. Or maybe he hadn't wanted to. They drove past the row of worker housing. Small homes patched with plywood. Yards frozen, toys half buried under ice. You couldn't build wealth without shadows. He knew that now. He'd hired people to keep him from seeing them. Lily pointed ahead. "That's where we live." The house was a narrow rectangle, paint peeling, one gutter hanging loose. A cardboard snowman taped to the window smiled up at the gray sky. Jonathan cut the engine. They stepped out, boots crunching over old gravel. The door was locked. Lily knocked once, twice, then rested her forehead against the wood. "She always leaves it open for me," she whispered. Jonathan tried the window. It slid up with a groan, years of habit overriding caution. Inside, the air was cold, as though the heater hadn't run in days. There was no sign of forced entry. No struggle. Just absence. The kind that felt loud. Lily walked to the kitchen. On the table sat a dinner plate, covered with a napkin now stiff with cold. Next to it, a note in hurried handwriting. "Back soon. Love you." "Don't worry." Jonathan picked it up, fingers closing around the weight of it. The ink was smudged. Written quickly. Written while afraid. Lily climbed onto a chair, folding her legs beneath her. She didn't speak. Her eyes stared at the empty seat across from her, the one that should have been filled. Jonathan knelt beside her. "Did your mom tell anyone she was worried about the plant?" he asked gently. Lily's gaze dropped to her lap. She talked to Mr. Pike sometimes. At the gate. He said bad things were happening inside. She said she was going to tell someone, but she didn't say who. Jonathan's breath slowed. Mr. Pike. He remembered that name. Security guard. 15 years of service. Fired during the ownership transfer, just months before safety complaints had started. Snow flurries drifted past the window. He could feel eyes in the wind. Watching. Timing. "Lily," he said quietly, "we have to go. Not just to find your mom, but because someone else may be coming." She slid off the chair without a word. She didn't cry. Didn't break. She just nodded, and something about that nearly broke him. When they stepped outside again, Jonathan noticed it, fresh tire tracks cutting through the snow, turning down the road just minutes before they arrived. Someone had already come looking. The road into Brighton grew narrower the farther they drove, the snow thinning into slush that carried the gray soot of the town's smokestacks. Winter didn't look soft here. It looked tired. Salt-stained sidewalks, flickering street lamps, buildings that sagged under the weight of years. Lily sat pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the world she knew change shape in front of her. Jonathan didn't speak. Neither did she. There was something sacred about silence when grief hadn't fully arrived yet. Only the awareness of something missing, like a tooth you keep touching with your tongue. They turned down the old industrial road that wound toward the Brighton energy plant. The gates were chained shut with new locks, ones that didn't match the rusted metal around them. A sign hung crookedly. Property of Stratton Energy. No entry. Lily stared at the faded company logo. "My mom said they changed the name, but nothing else changed," she murmured. Jonathan felt something shift under his ribs. "No," he said quietly. "Something did." He had built this plant when he was 32. He remembered the opening ceremony, the speeches, the applause, the promises. Jobs for the valley, economic revival, a future. But profit had eaten those promises whole. Lily tugged his coat sleeve. "There's another way in." She was already walking before he could stop her, her small boots crunching across the snow-packed gravel toward the back fencing. She slipped through a gap between two fallen metal panels, the kind someone had meant to fix but never did. He followed. Inside, the plant was a skeleton of steel and echoing corridors, the smell of rust mixed with the sharp tang of old chemicals. The overhead lights flickered weakly as though struggling to remember how to shine. The building exhaled long, empty breaths that whispered through the pipes. Lily walked like she had been here before. "She used to bring me lunch sometimes," she said softly. "When the babysitter couldn't come, she told me to stay close and not touch anything because the machines bite." Jonathan's throat tightened. They turned down a hallway lined with lockers. Most had been pried open. Others still carried faded employee stickers, names of people who had built their lives here. Lives like Rachel's, lives like the ones Jonathan had signed away with a pen. A flash of metal caught Lily's eye. She bent down and lifted a badge from the floor. Rachel Carter, line technician. The lanyard was torn, the plastic cracked. Jonathan knelt beside her. "This means she was here," he said. His own voice betrayed him. Hope and dread tangled too close to separate. Before Lily could answer, a noise echoed down the corridor. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, confident. Jonathan pulled Lily behind a row of lockers, pressing her gently against the wall. The footsteps grew louder. Two men appeared, both in thick jackets, not uniforms, private. One held a flashlight, the other held something worse. A sheriff's badge glinted faintly in the dim light. "Sheriff Collins," his voice traveled down the hall. "Check every room. Kane wants this handled before the snow clears. Kane, Arthur Kane." Jonathan felt the cold sink deeper into him. Colder than the storm outside. Didn't need anyone to explain what handled. Meant Lily clutched his sleeve. Her whisper was so soft it almost dissolved in the flickering dark. "They're not looking for her to save her, are they?" Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. "No," he whispered back. They're not. He lifted her into his arms and began to move, not out of fear, but out of choice. Because now this wasn't about guilt. It was about war. The cold clung to them as they left the plant, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and left a ghost of frost inside the lungs. Jonathan didn't speak until they were back in the truck, engine rumbling low, the heater struggling to push warmth into the stale air. Lily sat beside him, her legs drawn up, her hands wrapped around the stuffed fox as though it were the only thing tethering her to the world. What did they mean? She asked quietly, her voice small but steady. Who is Kane? Jonathan didn't answer right away. There were truths that shattered something when spoken aloud. But Lily had already endured too much for soft lies. Arthur Kane, he said finally, eyes fixed on the windshield. He's the man who took over the plant after I stepped down. He doesn't care who gets hurt as long as no one stops him. A long pause, like my mom. Jonathan's hand tightened on the steering wheel. Shame poured through him, slow and heavy. He didn't say the thing that sat like iron just beneath his ribs, and I helped put him there. They drove out of town, avoiding the main road. The men from the plant could still be searching. Jonathan's mind raced through names, connections, leverage, old instincts from a world he had sworn to leave behind. But this wasn't about saving a company or an image. This was a child. This was a mother. This was a reckoning. They reached the old diner on the edge of Riverbend just before sunset. Warm light spilled from its windows, cutting a thin line of gold into the growing night. A neon sign buzzed weakly overhead, half burned out so that it read simply, DIER inside. The diner smelled of stale coffee and long conversations that had ended without answers. A man sat alone in a booth near the back, graying hair, coat worn, eyes sharp enough to see through almost anything. Daniel Ward. Jonathan had not seen him in 3 years. The last time they spoke, Daniel had called him a coward. Jonathan deserved it. He guided Lily into the booth beside him. Daniel looked at her, then at Jonathan, and the judgment he had carried in his eyes for years softened just enough to show a crack of something like understanding. I heard, Daniel said quietly. Rachel was asking questions. She was close. Lily looked up. What was she close to? Daniel didn't speak to the child like she needed protecting from the truth. He spoke to her like she was already standing in it. Your mom found something at the plant. Something she wasn't supposed to see. The company has been dumping waste into the reservoir. Poison. The kind that makes people sick slowly. The kind you don't notice until it's too late. Lily didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She told me, she whispered. She said the water tasted like metal for weeks. Jonathan felt the world tilt. Daniel leaned forward, voice low, urgent. She was gathering proof. A ledger. Names, dates, shipments. If we can find it, we can expose everything. But the moment Kane realized what she was doing, he took her, Jonathan finished. Voice rough. Daniel nodded. Silence settled. Not empty. Heavy. Lily looked between them, her small hands tightening around the fox until her knuckles went white. So we're going to find her, she said. Not a question, a promise. Jonathan met her eyes. And in that moment, the choice was no longer a question either. Yes, he said, we are. Outside, night wrapped itself over the valley, and somewhere, in the dark, a woman was still waiting to be found. Night had fully settled by the time they left the diner. The air outside had changed, no longer just cold but watchful. The kind of night where even silence feels like it's listening. Jonathan pulled his coat tighter around Lily as they crossed the parking lot. Daniel walked beside them, his jaw set, his expression harder than it had been inside. Once, years ago, he and Jonathan had stood shoulder to shoulder at boardroom tables and charity galas. Now they stood together in something far more dangerous. They drove north toward the reservoir, headlights cutting thin blades through the dark. The road wound along the edge of frozen water, the surface reflecting the moon in a fractured silver glow. Lily leaned forward between the seats, studying the landscape like she was searching for something she'd seen only in memory. She talked about a tunnel, Lily murmured suddenly. Under the plant. She said they weren't supposed to know about it. Daniel nodded. Waste tunnels. From when the plant first opened. They should have been sealed years ago. Jonathan didn't respond. He knew. He knew why they hadn't been sealed. His signature had been on the cost-cutting directive. The guilt rose in him, thick and suffocating. He kept driving. The entrance wasn't hard to find. An old maintenance shack near the tree line, half collapsed under the weight of snow and time. The metal door hung crooked, its lock snapped long ago. Daniel pushed it open with his shoulder, flashlight beam slicing through the stale darkness. The air smelled of rust and chemical rot. Jonathan felt Lily's small hand slip into his. Not for comfort. She was steady in a way that should have belonged to someone older. She held his hand to anchor him. They stepped into the tunnel. The narrow corridor stretched ahead, its walls sweating with cold condensation. Their footsteps echoed softly, a ghostly rhythm that made the place feel alive in a way that was wrong. Like something breathing below the earth. Halfway in, Lily stopped. She knelt. Picked something up. A small flashlight. Cracked. The casing still faintly warm. Mom's, she whispered. Jonathan crouched beside her. Are you sure? She nodded once. Unshakable. Daniel raised his light further down the tunnel. That was when they saw the smear on the metal railing. Dark, dried, fingerprints trailing downward. A trail of struggle. A trail of desperation. A trail of someone fighting to hold on. Jonathan's heartbeat slammed. Vicious, relentless. Rachel was here, Daniel said, voice low, and she wasn't alone. Before Jonathan could speak, the tunnel trembled with a distant echo. Not footsteps, engines. From outside, Lily's eyes widened, not with fear, but with something colder. They followed us. Jonathan grabbed her, pulling her close. They turned back toward the entrance, but the world outside was no longer still. Headlights flared through the broken doorway. Voices barked orders. Men moved as shadows, against the freezing night. Daniel grabbed Jonathan's arm. There's another way out. The tunnel splits. Deep in. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He lifted Lily into his arms. They ran. The tunnel swallowed them. The darkness was absolute, but it was not empty. Somewhere ahead, in the deep where the cold could no longer reach, a mother was waiting, or a truth was. The deeper they went, the more the tunnel changed. The steel walls gave way to rough concrete, then to rock, a throat carved into the mountain decades ago, never meant to be walked by anyone who wasn't trying to disappear. The air grew warmer, thicker, carrying a faint metallic scent that clung to the tongue. Each step echoed, but the echoes felt wrong, like the sound was bending, swallowed by something unseen. Jonathan carried Lily close, her small arms looped around his neck. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. But her cheek rested against his shoulder, like she finally needed to borrow a heartbeat. Daniel led, his flashlight cutting through the dark in thin, trembling arcs. His breathing was steady, but Jonathan could hear the strain beneath it. Not fear, but urgency. They reached an old metal door at the end of the passage, bolted, rusted, sealed with fresh weld marks scorched into the steel. Someone had blocked it recently, too recently. Jonathan ran his fingers across the metal. Cold, slick, industrial. This wasn't sealed when we were here last, Daniel said quietly. Jonathan didn't answer. He didn't look away from the welds. Kane knew. Kane always knew. A sound broke the silence. Not the echo of the tunnel, something behind the door. A soft scrape, a breath. A faint knock. Jonathan slammed his palm against the steel. Rachel! His voice cracked. Rachel, can you hear me? For one suspended heartbeat, nothing. Then, 3 faint knocks. Hesitant, weak, but alive. Lily's breath left her in a shudder. Mommy. Her voice broke on the Y, and for the first time since she'd arrived on his doorstep, she sounded her age. Jonathan grabbed the wheel pipe leaning against the wall and drove it into the first weld seam. The metal clanged, sparks spitting into the dark. Daniel joined him, shoulder to shoulder, swinging the crowbar he had found among discarded tools. The door groaned, but it didn't give. Behind them, the thunder of footsteps echoed through the tunnel. Men. Voices. Orders. They were out of time. Daniel's flashlight flickered, then steadied. His jaw tightened. "Go," he said. Jonathan froze. "No. Yes." Daniel shoved him hard toward the door. "I'll slow them down." "You get her out!" Lily clung tighter. "No, we can't leave him." Daniel knelt, eye level with her. His voice softened in a way Jonathan had never heard. "You found us. You brought us here. You don't lose two people tonight. Understand?" Lily's face crumpled, just for a heartbeat. Then she nodded. She understood more of this world than any child should. Daniel straightened, turned, and disappeared into the dark behind them. His silhouette became shadow, then sound, then nothing but distant shouts and crashing metal. Jonathan didn't watch. He tore at the weld again, muscles burning, breath ragged. Lily helped, small fingers pulling where she could, whispering to the door like it could hear her. "It's okay, Mommy. We're here." "We're here!" The seam split. The metal buckled. Jonathan wrenched the door open. Inside, the air was damp and heavy. A single emergency light flickered overhead, throwing dim orange across the room. Crates lined the walls. Machinery hummed somewhere deep, low as a heartbeat, and in the corner, slumped against the wall, was Rachel gaunt, tired, bruised, but alive. Her eyes lifted. They found Lily first, and everything dissolved. Lily ran. Rachel caught her, arms weak but fierce, burying her daughter against her chest, rocking her, whispering something Jonathan couldn't hear. Something only mothers say when they get a second chance at a goodbye they thought would be forever. Jonathan looked away. Because some moments are prayers and prayers aren't to be stared at. Then Rachel's gaze lifted to him. Recognition. Pain. And something worse. "You," she whispered. Not gratitude. Not relief. A truth like a blade. She knew who had once signed the papers that allowed this place to become what it became. Jonathan swallowed hard, breath shivering in his chest. "I'm here to fix it," he said quietly. Rachel held her daughter closer. Her voice was barely sound. Then, "You'd better start running." Tunnel behind them roared with chaos. Shouts, boots striking concrete, metal scraping metal. Rachel tried to stand but faltered, her legs stiff from days, maybe weeks, of confinement. Jonathan caught her before she hit the ground. Lily clung to her mother's coat, refusing to let go even for a breath. "We have to move," Jonathan said, voice low but urgent. "Daniel bought us time, but not much." Rachel's eyes flicked toward the tunnel darkness. Pain flickered there. Fear. Guilt. That terrible knowledge that someone else was risking everything for her. But she didn't argue. She just nodded, jaw tightening with the kind of strength you find only after you've lost everything except what matters most. They went deeper instead of back, down the second branch of the tunnel, where old pipelines ran along the ceiling like metal ribs. Rachel guided them, one hand on the wall, the other wrapped around Lily, as though letting go would make the child dissolve. They were moving the barrels, Rachel whispered, into the reservoir. Not slowly, all at once. I recorded it. I hid the ledger under. A flashlight beam cut across the tunnel from behind them. "Go!" Jonathan hissed. They ran. The tunnel narrowed. Cold air rushed past them like the mountain was inhaling. Jonathan heard the men give chase, their shouts ricocheting off the stone. The ground sloped downward until they reached a steel maintenance hatch. Rusted. Frozen. Rachel pressed her palm flat against it, breath shaking. "This leads to the spillway," she whispered. "If we can get outside, we can get to the road. Someone will see us." Jonathan slammed his shoulder against it once. Twice. It didn't break. Lily stepped forward. She placed her small hand on the hatch, and she looked at Jonathan the way she had the very first night, like he was her last and only chance. He struck harder. Metal screamed. hatch burst open, spilling icy air into the tunnel. They climbed out into blinding moonlight. The reservoir lay below them, black and glassy, surrounded by a ring of frost. Pines leaned like silent watchers along the slope. The world felt enormous, finally open, but no safer than before. Footsteps crashed behind them. Jonathan grabbed Rachel's hand. Rachel grabbed Lily's. They ran down the slope, snow kicking up around their legs in bright sprays of white. The men emerged from the hatch shouting, weapons drawn. A shot rang out, skimming the snow near Jonathan's feet. He shoved Lily and Rachel behind a rock outcrop, shielding them with his body. Then, sirens, echoing up the valley, bright, sharp, unmistakable. Headlights burst over the ridge. The sheriff's deputies this time, real ones, not the ones Kane controlled. Red and blue lights splashed across the snow. The men at the hatch froze, just long enough. One more shout. One more shot. Then they scattered into the trees, disappearing like shadows fleeing daylight. Jonathan's breath left him in a rush he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Rachel sagged against the rock, Lily pressed between them. The child wasn't crying. She was breathing, deep and slow, like someone coming back to life one heartbeat at a time. Rachel turned to Jonathan. For the first time since the door had opened, her voice held something other than pain. "Thank you." Jonathan shook his head, slow, hollow. "No, I'm the reason any of this was possible. I let men like Kane run this place. I trusted numbers more than people. I signed papers I didn't want to read because the profits looked clean." Rachel reached out and placed her hand over his. It was bruised, cold, shaking, but steady. Then, "Fix it," she said. "Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Direction, a path." Jonathan nodded once, like a vow sealing itself inside his bones. The sirens grew louder. Voices echoed. Flashlights swept over the snow as rescue crews rushed toward them. Lily leaned into her mother, who wrapped both arms around her, burying her face in her daughter's hair. Not with fear, with home. Jonathan stepped back, watching them, not as a savior, not as a billionaire, not as a man running from his past, but as a man who finally understood what it meant to fight for something more than himself. The night air stung his lungs. The stars above the valley shone cold and sharp. And somewhere inside him, something thawed.